Last summer, I pulled 43 pounds of tomatoes off 2 plants in a 4x8 raised bed. 2 plants? And the year before that, in the same bed, with the same seeds, I got maybe a dozen tomatoes total. The only thing that changed was how and when I fed them. Here's the thing. Most folks grab a bag labeled tomato food, dump it in all season long, and never realize that's the exact move starving their harvest. I did it the wrong way for years. I'm going to show you the simple feeding schedule that fixed it, and stick around because at the end, I'll share the one cheap ingredient I add right before fruit sets that nobody seems to talk about. Let me confirm that number, because it sounds like a stretch until you see it. 43 pounds. I weighed every one of those tomatoes on the digital kitchen scale I keep on the counter, and they came off 2 plants growing in my 4x8 raised bed, the one I built from reclaimed cedar fence boards. The year before, same bed, same seeds, same Sacramento soil. I pulled maybe a dozen tomatoes the whole season. Here's the thing. I didn't change the variety. I didn't change the dirt. I didn't even change how often I watered. The only thing I changed was how and when I fed those plants. Most folks grab a bag labeled tomato food, dump it in all season long, and never realize it's loaded with nitrogen that builds leaves instead of fruit. I did that exact thing for years, so I'm going to walk you through this in 5 steps, from reading the label to the one move at flowering that turned a dozen tomatoes into 43 pounds. And stick around to the end because I'll share the one cheap ingredient I add right before fruit sets that nobody seems to talk about. Let's get into it. Step 1. Learn what's actually in that bag before you feed a single plant. Every bag of fertilizer has 3 numbers on the front, separated by dashes, and for years I bought bags without ever knowing what they meant. Here's the plain English version. That first number is nitrogen, and nitrogen builds leaves. The middle number is phosphorus, and phosphorus builds roots and flowers. The third number is potassium, and potassium builds fruit. That's it. 3 numbers, 3 jobs. Most of those bags labeled tomato food are heavy on that first number, the nitrogen, which means you're pouring leaf food on a plant when what you really want is fruit. Once I understood that, I stopped grabbing whatever had a tomato on the label and started reading the back. The win here is small, but it changes everything that follows. The day you can glance at 3 numbers and know exactly what each one does, you've already stopped feeding blind. You're feeding on purpose. Step 2. Feed for roots the day you plant, not before, not later. Out here in Sacramento, my last frost lands somewhere between February 25th and March 5th, and I plant my tomatoes out about 14 days after that, so right around the middle of March. Not earlier, even when the weather teases me. When I dig the planting hole, I work in 2 shovelfuls of finished compost and a handful of a balanced feed or some bone meal right down where the roots are going to go. Bone meal is loaded with that middle number, the phosphorus, and phosphorus is exactly what a young transplant wants. It tells the plant to put its energy down into the ground and build a strong root system before it ever thinks about leaves or fruit. The failure mode here is planting into bare native soil and hoping for the best. I tried that my first couple seasons in this bed, dropping seedlings into raw clay loam, and the plants just sat there sulking for 3 weeks. Feed the whole, and within 10 days, you'll see the plant stand up taller and put out new growth. That's the root system getting to work underground where you can't see it. That's your second win. Step 3. Go light on the nitrogen through the first 4 or 5 weeks, and I mean light. This is the vegetative stage, when the plant is building its frame, growing the stems and leaves it'll need to support fruit later. The plant does want a little nitrogen here, so I give it 1 light feeding to keep things moving. 1. Not a feeding every week. Not a scoop every time I walk by with the watering can. Here's where I have to be honest with you, because this is exactly where I went wrong for years. I figured if a little fertilizer was good, more was better. So I kept dumping that high nitrogen tomato food in all season long, start to finish. And I grew the most beautiful plants you've ever seen. 5 feet tall, dark green, bushy. Gorgeous. I called it my green monster year. And when I went looking for tomatoes, I found maybe a dozen hiding in all those leaves. That's the trap. All that nitrogen told the plant to keep making leaves and never bother making fruit. The plant was doing exactly what I told it to do. I just told it the wrong thing. So through these first 4 or 5 weeks, one light nitrogen feeding builds your frame, and then you ease off. The win at this stage is a sturdy plant that's tall enough and leafy enough to support a heavy crop without crossing over into that all leaves no fruit jungle. You want a strong frame. You don't want a green monster. Step 4. This is the switch, and this is the one move that turned a dozen tomatoes into 43 pounds. The moment the first flower clusters open, you cut the nitrogen entirely and switch over to a low nitrogen, high potassium feed. That's a fertilizer where the first number is small and the third number is big. From that point on, I feed every 10 to 14 days, not more often. Here's why this works. When those first little yellow flowers open up, the plant is telling you it's done growing leaves and it's ready to make fruit. If you keep feeding nitrogen now, you drag it right back into leaf mode and you starve the harvest. But if you switch to potassium right at that flowering signal, you're feeding the plant exactly what it needs to set fruit and fill it out. I learned to watch for that flowering cue from Gloria, my old mentor who's been growing food on her San Francisco balcony for over 20 years. She has a saying, "The plant tells you when it's hungry and what for. You just have to learn to read it." The first flowers are the plant telling you it's time to stop feeding leaves and start feeding fruit. Once I started making that switch on the exact day the first clusters opened, instead of feeding the same bag all season, my plants went from a dozen sad tomatoes to more than I could eat, can, and give away to the neighbors. The win here is the big one. Make this single switch at the right moment, and you'll watch flower clusters turn into fruit clusters, and the fruit will keep coming. Now here's where most people mess up the timing, so let me be specific. The cue is not a calendar date. It's not week 6 or the 1st of June. The cue is visual. You're looking for the first real flower clusters opening, those little yellow blooms in a group. Some seasons mine flower earlier, some later, depending on how the spring runs out here. I check my plants every morning with my coffee, and the day I see those flowers open, that's the day the nitrogen stops. I keep a small bag of the high potassium feed right by the back door so I'm never tempted to reach for the wrong thing out of laziness. Treat the first flower like a starting gun. The plant just told you the race changed. Step 5. Hold the line steady all the way through harvest and pair every feeding with consistent, deep watering. Once you've made the switch, you keep that same low nitrogen, high potassium feed going every 10 to 14 days, right through the whole fruiting season. Don't get fancy, don't keep changing products, don't suddenly panic and reach back for the nitrogen bag because the plant looks like it could use a boost. Steady wins here. The plant has a rhythm now, and your job is to keep feeding that rhythm. But feeding is only half of it, and this is the part folks skip. Potassium can only do its job if the soil stays evenly moist. That nutrient moves through water, and if your soil swings from bone dry to soaking wet and back again, the plant can't move the potassium and calcium into the fruit where it's needed. That's when you get trouble. The failure mode at this stage is erratic watering, and it shows up in 2 ugly ways. First, blossom end rot, that nasty black sunken patch on the bottom of the tomato, which comes from the plant not being able to move calcium into the fruit in dry, uneven soil. Second, cracking, where the fruit splits open because it got a sudden flood of water after a dry spell and swelled too fast. I lost a whole flush of beautiful fruit to cracking one July when I went away for a few days and let the bed dry out, then drowned it when I got back. So I watered deep and consistent, soaking the root zone, then letting the top inch dry before the next soak rather than splashing a little on every day. In our Sacramento summers, that usually means a good deep soak every couple of days, more when it's really hot. The win here is fruit that ripens clean and heavy, without rot on the bottom and without splits down the side. Steady feed, steady water, all the way through. That's the whole rhythm. Let me put the whole schedule together so you can see the shape of it. At transplant in mid-March, you feed the whole with compost and bone meal for roots. Through the first 4 or 5 vegetative weeks, you give 1 light nitrogen feeding to build the frame, and then you back off. The day the first flowers open, you cut nitrogen completely and switch to a low nitrogen, high potassium feed every 10 to 14 days. And you hold that feed steady, paired with deep, consistent watering, all the way through harvest. 4 moves, and the whole thing turns on that one switch at flowering. That's the difference between the Green Monster year and the 43-pound year in the same 4x8 bed, with the same seeds, the same dirt. The plant always knew what it wanted. I just finally started listening. And the thing I want you to take away from all 5 of these steps is that you're not feeding a tomato plant. You're feeding a tomato plant at a specific stage of its life. The young plant wants roots, so you give it phosphorus. The growing plant wants a frame, so you give it a little nitrogen. The flowering plant wants fruit, so you give it potassium, and you stop the nitrogen cold. Match the feed to the stage, and you stop fighting your own plants. I weighed last year's haul on the same little digital kitchen scale I used to portion out coffee, batch after batch, because I genuinely didn't believe the number until I saw it. 43 pounds off 2 plants. Same scale, same bed, same hands. The only thing that changed was that I learned to feed the plant what it was actually asking for, when it was asking for it. Now, before we go any further into where this can still go sideways, I want to share something with you that takes this whole approach one step further and costs you nothing at all. Now, if what I'm showing you today is making sense, and you're starting to realize you've been buying bags of fertilizer when you never had to, here's something worth knowing. Every feed I've described can come straight out of your own kitchen for free. The compost and worm castings I work into that bed cost me nothing but the scraps I used to toss in the trash. That's exactly what Chapter 6 of my book, The 30-Day Kitchen Scrap Garden Protocol, walks you through. Composting in small spaces with illustrated worm bin and bokashi setups you can run on a balcony. It's $17 at backyardbuddybooks.com. If you're watching on your TV, grab your phone and point it at the QR code on screen. Take your time pulling it up. No rush, I'll be right here. All right, let's keep going. Here's where most folks trip themselves up, and I've made every one of these myself. The first mistake is sticking with that same high nitrogen bag after the flowers show up. Keep feeding nitrogen once you see blossoms, and you'll keep growing leaves instead of fruit, and your fruit set can drop dramatically. The fix is simple. Cut the nitrogen the day you spot the first flowers. No exceptions. The second mistake is feeding too often, thinking more has to be better. For 2 seasons, I topped off whenever I happened to remember, and all I did was burn the roots and push out soft, tender growth that the aphids swarmed all over within a week. Feed on the 10 to 14-day rhythm, not whenever the mood strikes you. The third mistake is the sneaky one, because you can feed perfectly and still lose the crop. If your watering is all over the place, potassium can't move into the fruit. The soil keeps swinging from bone dry to soaked, and that's how you end up with cracked tomatoes and that ugly brown blossom end rot on the bottom of every fruit. The fix is deep, consistent watering paired with every single feeding. I water slow and I water deep, the same amount on the same days, and I haven't seen blossom end rot in that bed since. None of these are complicated. They're just easy to forget in the middle of a busy summer. Get those 3 right, and you've eliminated the ways this goes wrong for almost everybody. I told you at the start I'd share the one cheap ingredient I add right before fruit sets, the one nobody seems to talk about. Here it is, wood ash, plain wood ash, free from a fireplace or the bottom of a charcoal grill. The moment those first flower clusters open, I scratch about a 1/4 cup of cooled ash into the top inch of soil around each plant, then water it in. That's the whole move. Now here's why it works, because the why matters more than the what. Wood ash is loaded with potassium, and potassium is the exact nutrient that drives flowering, fruit set, and the movement of sugars up into the fruit itself. So you're handing the plant a shot of the one thing it craves at the precise moment, it stops growing leaves and starts making tomatoes. That's why it bumps both your yield and your flavor. The sugars are what make a homegrown tomato taste like something the store version can only dream about. One honest caveat, and this one matters. Wood ash raises your soil pH, so you have to use it sparingly. A quarter cup per plant, watered in once when the flowers open, and no more than that. Dump a coffee can of ash in there, and you'll swing your soil too alkaline and cause more trouble than you solved. A quarter cup, once. That's the difference between a free boost and a free mistake. Before I let you go, if you're sitting there thinking your space is too small or you've failed at this before, I want you to hear me. The 43 pounds came out of one little 4x8 bed I built from old fence boards. Chapter 7 of the book, Scaling Up from Windowsill to Backyard, walks you through raised bed basics for small yards, companion planting, and succession planting, so something's always coming in, all with illustrated diagrams. It's the guide I wish I'd had 10 years ago when I was killing tomatoes in a Portland apartment. Head to backyardbuddybooks.com, or if you're on the TV, point your phone at the QR code on screen. Go ahead and grab it now. Take your time, I'll wait. That little bed is all the room you need to start. So that's the whole thing, a phased feeding schedule that gives the plant nitrogen early, cuts it cold at flowering, and switches to potassium, plus a quarter cup of free wood ash right when the flowers open. That's how I get 43 pounds off 2 plants in a bed the size of a coffee table. If you want more ways to grow real food in small spaces without spending a fortune, this is the kind of thing I dig into here. Next time you water, water deep and even. Your tomatoes will thank you. Make that nitrogen to potassium switch this season, just on one plant. And let me know in the comments how it goes. Until next time, keep growing your own food, my friend.